University of Maine Cooperative Extension Preserving the Maine Harvest webinar. I'm Kathy Savoie, and we will also be joined by two other colleagues today, Kate McCarty in the demo kitchen. Hi there, Kate. And also Laurie Bowen behind the scenes as our producer. So this webinar series is designed to provide you with current USDA recommendations for preserving food at home. Our weekly webinars feature foods that are in season and that are corresponding with the Maine growing cycle throughout the year. And we all know we've had a banner year for growing tomatoes, so we're going to talk about those today. First off, the mission of the University of Maine Cooperative Extension is to help Maine people improve their lives through an educational process that uses research-based knowledge focused on issues and needs. Our educational programs include agriculture, horticulture, including our Master Gardener program, 4-H youth development, food safety, and nutrition. And finally, we want to let you know that the University of Maine is prohibited from discriminating on the basis of race, color, national origin, sex, age, disability, and reprisal or retaliation for prior civil rights activity. Today, we will focus on canning and freezing tomatoes. First, some housekeeping. We have our webinar set up so that you can hear and see us, but we cannot hear or see you. But we do want to hear from you. So we want to be able to answer your questions. So please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A box throughout the presentation. And we will have a specific time where we will answer those questions and get any and all of them answered and point you in the direction of the correct resources for those. So thanks again for joining us, and let's get started. It's August, and August in Maine means plenty of summer tomatoes. Whether you managed to grow your own good crop this year, despite the persistent drought, or if you are buying them in bulk from a local farmer, or if you're receiving a donation from your gardening neighbors, remember that tomatoes can and freeze well for use later in cooked dishes, things like soups, stews, pasta dishes, and casseroles. First, let's talk about a question that we get asked a lot. Many people are surprised to learn of the recommendation to acidify tomatoes when canning them. This recommendation, which I really prefer to refer to as a requirement, came out in 1988, and it's based on a growing concern that tomatoes were not acidic enough for canning safely at home on their own. Tomatoes are borderline acidic, and depending on the variety, their stage of ripeness, the growing conditions, the soil, the weather, and even the sunlight, their acidity goes back and forth across that safe line between acidic and non-acidic. That pH can range up to 4.8 or higher, sometimes even up to 5.01. And as the pH scale is a logarithmic, meaning that that 0.2 difference above the safe cutoff of 4.6, that is actually a lot and is quite significant when we talk about it from a food safety standpoint. So all home canned tomatoes require acidification. This includes tomato juice, crushed tomatoes, standard tomato sauce, tomatoes that are canned either whole, halved, crushed, and even salsas. So here is a slide on the USDA recommendations for acidifying tomatoes. You can see that the recommendations are for using either citric acid, bottled lemon juice, or vinegar specific to 5% acidity. You simply need to add that amount of acidulant per jar prior to filling the jar with your tomato product. So this step will safely acidify the tomato volume per pint or quart-sized jar, whichever you're using for processing. We want to make sure and emphasize the following point. Citric acid is not ascorbic acid. You cannot use these products interchangeably. So make sure you're using the citric acid, and that is what's recommended for safety. And then when we talk about lemon juice, we want to make sure that you see that the word bottled lemon juice is used to describe the lemon juice. Bottled lemon juice is used, not fresh lemon juice. Bottled lemon juice has a standard identity for pH, whereas fresh squeezed lemon juice does not. Notice that the vinegar amount is much higher in volume than the other two acidifiers. And some people do not like the taste change that brings about. You can alter that bitter vinegar taste by adding a little bit of sugar to offset the flavor change. Sugar does not adjust pH. You will notice that the USDA gives processing times for tomatoes in either the boiling water bath or the pressure canner. Oftentimes we get asked, do I need to acidify my tomatoes that I am pressure canning? The answer is yes. Once again, the answer is yes. You do need to acidify tomatoes that you are pressure canning. But why? That's always a follow-up question. And this question is best answered by our colleagues at the National Center for Home Food Preservation. If a procedure from the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning for canning tomatoes offers both a boiling water bath and a pressure canning option, all the steps in the preparation, think of that as the procedure, are still required, even if the pressure canning option is chosen. This includes acidification. The boiling water and pressure canning alternatives are equal processes with different time and temperature combinations calculated for these products. The pressure processing option in these products were developed for tomatoes with added acid, so it is still required to add acid to your tomatoes that are processed in a pressure canner. It's a simple enough step, so just remember to do it with all of your tomato products, regardless of your processing. Let's talk a little bit about salt. As you review those USDA guidelines for canning tomatoes, you'll see that salt is listed as optional. Salt does not play a role in the safety of home canned tomatoes, so you can leave it out or add it based on your personal preference and also your plan for how you're going to use that tomato product. But again, salt, it's up to you. Let's also remember the importance of using the most high quality tomatoes. Tomatoes that have spoiled, are overripe, diseased, or caught by an early frost and are frost killed are not suitable for home canning. What my grandmother taught me years ago about food safety is still true today. When in doubt, throw it out. So now we're going to jump into our demo kitchen where we're going to have a live demo from Kate, and she's going to show us how to can crushed tomatoes. So Kate, take it away for one of our most popular home canned products.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us here today. So yes, I have my crushed tomatoes are ready to go. Before we get into actually putting them in the jars and canning them, though, I'm going to tell you all the things I did behind the scenes to get ready for you. So to begin, let's talk about the recipe itself. I chose crushed tomatoes because I find that's a product I buy a lot at the grocery store, and so I really like to have the home canned version. So crushed tomatoes are super simple to make. most canning tomato recipes look very simple on the face, but when you get into the actual work, you just find that it's very involved. So simple, but just a long process. But you'll begin by peeling the tomatoes, which is a whole activity in and of itself. So tomatoes are not peeled like you would peel an apple with a vegetable peeler or something. They are have very thin skins that are difficult to get off. And so the way to peel a tomato is to blanch it using boiling water and mark a little X in the non-stem end of the fruit. So the end opposite where it was attached to the plant. It'll have like a little stem scar. So the opposite end of that, you just score a little X, and that's breaking through the skin, which will allow it to split when you put it in the boiling water. So first step is to wash all of your tomatoes and then come through with a knife and just do a gentle X on the bottom. You're not trying to cut it into quarters or anything, but just lightly score the skin. So you'll do that for all of your tomatoes. And it also really helps to core them at this point while they're still raw and they don't have that cooked texture, so they're easier to core. And we love using these things we call tomato sharks. So it's like a little plastic tool. I got this at a restaurant supply store. It's very inexpensive, like $1.99. And it has little serrated metal teeth on the end of its little head. So you use this to scoop out the stem end of the tomato, as well as any bit inside that looks like something you wouldn't want to eat. So if it's like still green, like looks like part of the tomato plant, remove all that. So you just have that nice red, ripe flesh or whatever other color tomato variety you're using. So we're scoring, we're coring, and then you're ready to start blanching your tomatoes. So we are going to use a blanching basket insert into a stock pot, and that really aids in doing these in bulk. So you can just do them in boiling water if you don't have a blanching insert. But again, this just helps the process if you're doing a lot of tomatoes. So this is just a stock pot that then has a colander insert, the blanching basket, so it's got holes in it. So we fill it up with water so that it's about 2/3 of the way full in the pot. Bring it to a boil. And then you'll add a few of your cored and scored tomatoes into the water. And what the black basket does is it allows you to load this up with tomatoes and then lower it into the boiling water. And you wait about 30 to 60 seconds. This depends on how ripe your tomatoes are. But once you see where you cut the little X, it will start to split up the side of the tomato. You're not trying to cook the tomatoes. You're really just looking for that split, which indicates that the skins hopefully will come off easily. And then you can remove the entire batch by slowly, gently, because it's full of boiling water, lifting the basket up out of the pot. And then you'll have in here just all of your finished tomatoes, which you can dump into a bowl. So then once your tomatoes have been blanched 30 to 60 seconds, you want to cool them down so that you can handle them to peel the tomatoes. So we recommend using an ice bath, which is just a big bowl full of water and some ice. For days when I'm doing a lot of tomatoes, I will go and purchase like a 5-pound bag of ice from the store, because your ice trays, you'll go through those really quickly as the hot tomatoes melt the ice pretty rapidly. That's the point, to cool them down. So having a lot of ice on hand is really handy. So then you just work in batches until you've processed all your tomatoes while you're waiting for your water to boil with the split or scored tomatoes in it. You can start peeling the ones that are cool enough to handle and setting them aside, and you just repeat until all of your tomatoes have been peeled. So that's the part that can get a little, I don't call it tedious, but it's good to have a podcast on or a friend to help. And then for this particular recipe, so when you're peeled all your tomatoes, that's when you could pack them whole into your jars and add water, or crush them down until they make their own juice. You could cut them in half and can them in water, or you could do the crushed tomatoes, which is what I'm going to show you. So for crushed tomatoes, you quarter up, the recipe says 1/6 of them. So I just do like a layer on the bottom of the pot and heat that. So bring that to a simmer as you're continuing to quarter the rest of your tomatoes. And then you can go in and kind of start crushing those a little bit with your stirring spoon. I used a potato masher to give me the pieces size that I like. And then slowly heating those as you continue to process, peeling, coring or quartering, and then adding to your pot. So repeat until you have a pot full of your quartered tomatoes and you're heating them slowly. So once they all are in there together, they'll start to break down and heat through. And then you bring the whole thing to a boil and boil it for 5 minutes. So that's where we're at right now with the recipe. I've done all that work to prep a pot full of crushed tomatoes to can for you here today. They're nice and hot. I just turn the heat off after their recommended boiling time and then put the lid on so they stay hot for us. And then I've also done some behind the scenes work for the canning part. So I've got my boiling water bath canner here. And it is several pint jars in it. And I've covered them with water and I brought the whole thing to a boil. So what we're doing now is we're preheating our jars. So we've got hot jars, hot tomatoes going into simmering water. It's boiling, but I wish it were more like a simmering water. Crack the lid a little. So we're trying to get everything all the same temperature to avoid any breakage from thermal shock of having maybe a cold jar, putting hot tomatoes into it into boiling water. You don't need to pre-sterilize your jars for this recipe because our crushed tomatoes are processed for 35 minutes in a boiling water bath at our elevation in Falmouth, Maine, which is very close to sea level. So the sterilization recommendation only kicks in when you're processing recipes for 10 minutes or for less than 10 minutes. So if you're processing any recipe for 10 minutes or longer, you don't need to pre-sterilize your jars. So we're just heating them up in here. I washed the jars. I checked them over to make sure that they didn't have any chips or cracks. These are older jars. We're reusing them. So we want to make sure they're in good shape before we heat them up for canning today. I have new lids. So I washed up my little flat 2-piece dome lid, that being the first piece, and the screw bands, the second piece. Made sure they were the lids, the bands weren't dented or rusted. They're all in good shape. I set those aside for my equipment. And then the other things I have are the 3-piece canning kit that comes with a jar lifter to help me get the hot jars in and out of the canner, a jar funnel for filling the jars, and a Headspace Measurer. So this tool is used to measure how full we fill the jars. For this particular recipe, it's a 1/2 inch of headspace that we leave. So these little notches on the end, I'll demonstrate using it, but they help me measure that I'm leaving a 1/2 inch between the top of the crushed tomatoes and the top of the canning jar. So it's very important to get that precisely correct. We'll have an opportunity later on to explain to you how you can get a Headspace measuring tool if you didn't know that Headspace was so important and you want to be able to measure that yourself. So I think with that, I'm ready to get into filling my jars for my crushed tomatoes. I have here, like I said, I'm using that pint jar size. Get my overhead cam right so you guys can see everything I'm doing. And I'm going to take out, let's say 2 to do it once. Maybe at home when I wasn't yakking at the same time, I would do 3 or 4, but we don't want your product to cool down, your jars to cool down too much while you're filling them. So we'll just do 2 to demonstrate to begin. So got my empty jars here. And because we are doing home canned tomatoes, we are going to add some acidulants. So I go back and forth between the lemon juice and the citric acid. We can do like a few of each. So I'm going to start with the citric acids, which for pints is, let me move this jar and show you the label up close. So citric acid, this is obviously branded for canning. You could also find this in the cheese making supplies because it's used in cheese making as well. So you could order it online from a cheese making retailer or from canning, or find it in the canning supplies. And so this is required only a 1/4 teaspoon for pints. So you add it just directly to the bottom of the jar. So in it goes, just measuring very precisely because it is going to give it an acidic flavor, even though it's only a 1/4 teaspoon. So I want to make sure it's precisely measured. And once I'm happy with that, I'm going to add my funnel and ladle my crushed tomatoes in over the top. One second while I get everything together here without burning myself. All right. So crushed tomatoes, as you've seen at the store, kind of a mixture of like tomato pieces as well as the tomato liquid juice. So I like to give the pot with a stir with my ladle to make sure that I'm getting like a good ratio of solids and liquids. You don't want to inadvertently end up like scooping all of the solids into one jar and then be left with a jar that's really liquidy. Aside from that being like a quality issue, it's also a safety issue because it'll affect how the heat moves through the jars while they're being canned. All right, so fill that up, just eyeballing the headspace for now. I'll come back and measure. So once you've filled your jar, eyeballing the headspace, come in and measure with the Headspace measuring tool. So these are 1/4 inch steps on the end of this. So it's the second step up from the bottom. And you rest that on the rim of the jar. And then where it pokes down in should be level with the top of your product. In this case, your crushed tomato liquid. I'm taking a little out, make small adjustments with this little teaspoon. If you need to add some in or take some out, it's easier to do with a small spoon. And I'm happy with my headspace. So this product's nice and liquidy. So you don't need to be as concerned with the trapped air as you might, as if you were canning whole tomatoes or half tomatoes in water. But I'm still gonna make sure the air bubbles are removed. If there's trapped air in there, it could mess with the headspace when it comes up to the top. Or it could cause the jar to break if it's trapped air underneath like some tomato pieces. So adjust or free your bubbles with the other end of this plastic tool. You could use a plastic takeout knife or a wooden chopstick or something too. And then wipe off the rims of the jars where I got some tomato liquid. This is where the seal occurs between the glass and the underside of the lid. So you want to make sure that it's nice and clean. And then we'll add just one lid and tighten on screw bands until it's fingertip tight. So that means using only the strength of my fingers to tighten, not my whole hand. So just using the fingers, which, you know, your fingers are only so strong. So that'll keep you from over tightening the rings. If they're over tightened, the air that is in that headspace gap we left won't be able to escape, which could again cause the jar to break or your lids to buckle. So we're looking definitely to avoid that. So put them on there tightly, firmly, but not over tighten. And then repeat the process until all of your jars are elapsed. I'll do another round to demonstrate with the lemon juice. I think we have time for that. Somebody tell me if I'm incorrect, but we'll do one jar with the lemon juice just to show you the difference. So
We do have time to see that lemon juice acidification. So thanks, Kate. We've
Yep.
also had someone ask if we could do more of a split screen so folks can see Kate in the kitchen and then also the overhead. So maybe we could change to that view for this next example.
Let's try it.
There we go. Okay. Thank you, Laurie.
We love the idea of a split screen.
You're welcome.
We had some people complain in the past they couldn't see both screens, so we were hesitant to try it again. So if you have any feedback about liking or disliking it, please feel free to sound off. So the bottled lemon juice, you know, again, this is a product where we've heard from people that, you know, you're canning fresh food, avoiding the additives. So they don't like the recommendation to use bottled. They say I'd rather use fresh. From a local perspective, you know, here in Maine, we don't have local lemons. So that is kind of ruled out. But as far as the acidity goes, it is important enough where this is a necessary sacrifice to use this bottled product. And if it is something that you're looking to avoid altogether, you can search out the citric acid as a nice option too. So that was 1 tablespoon per pint jar. If you're doing quarts, it's simply 2 tablespoons. And I'm repeating the process of filling my jars, okay, with the crushed tomatoes. start with this guy. And I didn't do a great, I think the hard thing about canning tomatoes is it's difficult to know how many jars to prepare because the yield is kind of hard to predict. But from the National Center for Home Food Preservation, they do tell you how many pounds of tomatoes is necessary for 1 quart jar. So you can sit down, you need to weigh your tomatoes, either purchase them weighed from the farmer's market or invest in a food scale. And then do some back of the napkin math to determine, okay, if I had 50 pounds and that makes X number of quarts, if you're doing quarts, great. If you want to do pints, you would need to double that number to get your pints. So here's a great learning opportunity. I filled one, let me double check. Yep, filled 1 pint jar and was able to meet my headspace. The second jar, however, is not coming up to the required headspace. I'm just gonna pour what's left and cross my fingers and say, oh darn, I'm not gonna make it to the 1/2 inch headspace that's required for my last jar. Let me measure, it's over 1 inch of headspace. So this is a jar that's not going to be able to be processed in the boiling water bath canner in its current state. If you wanted to, you could get out a 8-ounce jar, wash it, throw it in the canner. It's a good idea to put a smaller size jar in there for every product, and then have it warmed, because we could meet the 1/2 inch headspace on an 8-ounce jar, because I have about 14 ounces of tomatoes here. So you could do a smaller jar. You could put it in a jar that could go into the freezer and freeze it, or you can just put it in your fridge and incorporate it into tonight's dinner. So there's options for these wonderful farmers markets tomatoes. But if you can't meet the minimum headspace required on a recipe, you can't can it. Oh, and I'm gonna do the bubble this jar just in case. Okay. Bubbled, wiped, 1 lid. And this one's going back into the boiling water bath canner. All right. So once my jar, all my tomatoes are canned or into jars, I'm gonna load up the canner and then check the amount of water over the tops of the jars. Make sure that I have at least 1 inch of water over the tops, but don't need more than 2, because then you're just waiting a long time for it to come back to a boil. I'm gonna turn up the heat so we don't have to wait that long. So what I like to do is use the Headspace Measurer and stick it in there and rest it on top of one of the jars. And then when I pull it out, you can't see it, but I can see that there's a little water line on the Headspace Measurer that shows me it's at least above the 1 inch steps that the little end of the tool measures. So I know I have at least 1 inch of water in there. I typically kind of overfill the canner and then measure this, and then we'll take some out. It's way better than not having enough water, and right now trying to boil water and add it to the canner to get that inch of water over the tops of your jars. So as far as finishing this process goes, I put the lid on. I'm happy with the amount of water in there. I turn the heat up to high, because our processing time for all boiling water bath products does not begin until the water returns to a boil. So you're looking for that boil to indicate you've reached 212 degrees Fahrenheit here at nearly sea level in coastal Maine. And that is the temperature you're going for to begin the processing time. For crushed tomatoes, it's 35 minutes in a boiling water bath canner. And I want to double check, is that pints? Yes, so 35 minutes for pints and 45 minutes for quarts of continuous boiling. So I'll be waiting a few minutes until I can see that there's a full rolling boil happening, and I'll begin my timer for 35 minutes. When the 35 minutes has elapsed, this is a very important step in regards to tomatoes. I'll turn the heat off, take the lid of the canner off, and let the jars sit in there for 5 additional minutes. And so this step is helping the jars to make the transition between the extremely hot canner environment to the relatively cool room, kitchen here, and helps to prevent siphoning, which is when that extreme temperature difference causes liquid loss. So if you've ever done any home canned tomatoes, one of the biggest questions we get is, I canned my tomatoes, I measured the headspace precisely. Then when they came out of the canner, I noticed I had lost a lot of liquid, and now some of the tomatoes are up above the liquid. So this would be for whole or half tomatoes in water or juice. And they're like, is it safe? Did I do something wrong? And that is the end result of siphoning, where you have that liquid loss. And it is safe as long as the jar is sealed. You might just notice the tomatoes above the liquid level get discolored because they're not protected by the liquid. So you'd want to like put those at the front of the pantry and make sure you use them up first. And then save the ones that didn't have liquid loss for later on. But that 5-minute cool down will really help mediate that siphoning. And then I'll take them out and let them cool for 12 to 24 hours to allow the seals to form. I'll come back and check that the seals have formed, and then remove the screw bands, label and date them, and then store them in a cool, dark, dry place. Try and use them within 1 year for best quality. If it's a little bit longer than that, just know the quality, color, texture, flavor might be decreased. So try and use them up before next summer. And then once you open them, use them within 2 weeks. Refrigerate them if you don't use the product all at once. But with pints of tomatoes, I frequently find I just open it and use it. So storing the leftover tomatoes is not an issue. All right. How did I do as far as covering everything you might want me to talk about?
I think you did an awesome job, Kate. We've got quite a few questions in the Q&A box, so we'll get to those soon, and I'll thank you for your demonstration, and we'll have you join us for the Q&A session in a little while. Keep processing. All right. So thanks again to Kate, and let's start off by discussing why you would choose to use a pressure canner or a boiling water bath when canning tomatoes. We just saw Kate using a boiling water bath in our demo kitchen, but some tomato recipes do provide processing instructions for both boiling water bath and pressure canning. So why would you choose one over the other? First, we want to clarify that some tomato products require processing in a pressure canner, like spaghetti sauce with or without meat, due to the pH of the products. You don't have a choice in those cases. But for crushed tomatoes, whole or halved tomatoes, tomato sauce, and tomato juice, there is the option to process in either a boiling water bath or a pressure canner. Research has shown that pressure canned tomatoes do have a higher nutrient value, a higher nutrient retention, due to the fact that they are heated for less time to a higher temperature. We have also seen in our master food preserver training, when we can tomatoes using both methods and can compare the jars side by side, that the pressure canned tomatoes look like a higher quality product than what we see coming out of the boiling water bath canned versions. We see that they have better color. There appears to be less shrinkage of the tomatoes in the jars. So again, that's what we're seeing coming from a pressure canned product. But many people may find that the boiling water bath method is more accessible and opt for that method over canning. You of course can choose the method that you feel most comfortable with when the recipe does give you that option. Remember that if you do use a dial gauge pressure canner, be sure to test the gauge annually for accuracy. We can test these dial gauges and let you know if you need to make any adjustments when processing, or if it's time to replace the dial gauge if it's too inaccurate. The service that we provide is free for Maine residents. If you are joining us from another state, please check in with your local extension office for information on their dial gauge testing. We will include who to contact at UMaine Extension for this free service in the follow-up resources that you get after today's webinar. So we're gonna break away from canning tomatoes for a minute and talk about freezing. Because while canning tomatoes is popular, we want to make sure you walk away from today's webinar knowing that freezing is one of the easiest ways to put up your tomatoes for use later during those nippy autumn days or those cold winter nights. While canning does have its advantages, sometimes you just want to head out to the beach rather than stand over a hot stove in August. I know I've had that experience personally. That's where freezing tomatoes comes in. And again, it is so easy. When selecting tomatoes for the freezer, any type will do. Whether you've got those big fat slicers that are dripping with juice, those elongated pear-shaped paste tomatoes, or even the colorful orbs of cherry tomatoes. But the preferred variety for freezing for many home preservers is those paste style tomatoes, also known as Roma tomatoes. These tomatoes, the Romas, the paste style, are different from the slicing tomato varieties because they have more of a meaty flesh. They have smaller seed cavities and actually smaller seeds overall, and a lot less water in the whole tomato. So they do make for a very pleasing final product from that thickness standpoint. And even making the freezing process even more simple is the fact that tomatoes do not need to be blanched before freezing. We do recommend that you wash and hull the tomato or remove the stem end before freezing to make it ready to eat. We're gonna watch a short video demonstration, and this will show you how simple it is to freeze whole tomatoes. So we'll give Laurie a minute to pull that up.
Hello, I'm Kathy Savoie, Extension Educator with the University of Maine Cooperative Extension. Today we're going to talk about tomatoes. We've had a wonderful growing season here in Maine, and it's time to preserve those tomatoes for use later on. When the garden's overflowing with lots of those great Maine tomatoes, remember, it is possible to quickly freeze raw tomatoes without blanching them first. Step 1, wash your tomatoes. Step 2, hull your tomatoes. Take a freezer bag. Go ahead and stack those tomatoes right into a freezer grade container. Leave room for the expansion that occurs during freezing. Remove as much air as possible from the bag and close that top. Place prepared tomatoes in the freezer, set at 0 degrees, and use within 8 to 12 months. Frozen tomatoes are great to have on hand in the off-season for use in soups, stews, chilies, and casseroles. The latest recommendations for home canning of tomato products includes acidification. Acidification ensures safe acidity levels in whole, crushed, or juiced tomatoes. Simply add 2 tablespoons of bottled lemon juice or a half a teaspoon of citric acid per quart of tomatoes. For pints, that's reduced to 1 tablespoon of bottled lemon juice or a 1/4 teaspoon of citric acid. Sugar to taste may be added to offset the acid taste. For a step-by-step guide on how to preserve your home tomatoes, refer to the Let's Preserve Tomato fact sheet available through the University of Maine Cooperative Extension.
All right, thanks so much. That video is 12 years old, but still shows how super simple it is to freeze your tomatoes. And just want to make sure you know, you can also cut tomatoes into pieces to freeze them. You can cut them in half, you can dice them. You can also cook them down into a sauce and freeze them. This would most likely be best in a rigid freezer grade container. You can make this as simple or as involved as you have the time for. Sometimes, like we've already said, it's nice just to be able to throw the whole tomato into the freezer and be done with them. We've already mentioned how to use those frozen tomatoes, but one question we get is how to take the skins off, because you saw they were frozen with the skins on. And as you cook those tomatoes down, you can just simply pull out the tomato skins. They will come off in large whole chunks. You could also hold the frozen tomato under running tap water, and that skin will again just be super easy to peel off. So I want to give plenty of time to get to our Q&A box because we've got a few good questions in there. So let's do that right now. So we've got a question about where can I buy citric acid? So that can be found wherever you find your home canning supplies. So a large department store, a hardware store. Some of our grocery stores do carry it, or like Kate mentioned, you may find it with the cheese making supplies, either online or at a store near you. And Kate, I'm just going to go down through these questions, and if you have anything to add, please feel free to jump right in.
Okay, I'm also typing answers because I see we have so many, so
Okay,
I
all
want to give
right,
people their answers.
all right, good. If my tomatoes have late blight, can I still use them? So the answer to that is no. Those would fall into the category of not the high quality tomatoes that we want you to be preserving for later on. So any tomato from a diseased plant, any tomato that does show sign of disease would not make the cut for our high quality produce that we want to be preserving. And
Kathy, we have a publication on that, or Penn State publication that we can send out, right? That we'll dig up to send. That has more information about late blight and canning tomatoes.
oh, that's right. Yeah, we can add that to our resources. Great idea. We've got another question. What is the water soluble vitamin loss like due to 35 minutes of boiling water temperature? Well, that, my friend, is truly one of the big questions that we always get around preserving our produce, is to what extent are we eroding our vitamin base? We know that minerals are very stable and we're not deteriorating or losing those during preserving as much as we are at risk for losing our vitamin content. And so 35 minutes in a high heat situation is definitely going to do some damage to those heat sensitive vitamins that are present. And so that is another one of the reasons why we like to encourage people to try and freeze those tomatoes, because we know that freezing will destroy fewer vitamins. And that is information that's known based on research. But we will have some vitamin loss in processing at a high temperature. How much, I'm not exactly sure, but remember that it is a tomato and it does still help you meet your fruit and vegetable requirements. So it does have some positive qualities to it, and you are losing some nutrients, but hopefully it's not bringing it down to make it null and void, and I'm sure it is not. So there's no need to do the acidification if freezing. That is true. You do not need to acidify your tomatoes if you are simply freezing them. And what is the purpose of Headspace? Is it more important to have at least 1 inch or less than 2 inches? So Headspace is that air pocket in the jar that's between the top of the product you're processing. So in the purpose of today's demonstration, that would be the top of the crushed tomatoes and then the top of the jar. So it's that little slight air pocket that you create between the dome lid and the top of the jar. And Kate's product today had 1/2 inch of Headspace, and that is the volume of air that is pushed out during the processing. And then the way that the 2-piece lids work is when the product is cooling, it creates a vacuum seal because it has pushed that air pocket out. So again, you follow the Headspace recommendations that are in the recipe And it's usually a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch, or if you're pressure canning, it would be more towards an inch. So I notice we are right at the end of our time for today. So we're going to answer these questions as part of our responses in the Q&A box. And we're going to jump ahead and let you know that we will be sending you lots of resources in addition to what we've shared with you today, and those will be handy for you to have at home. We also want to let you know that we'll be back next month to demonstrate freezing fruits and vegetables. And in addition to the resources you'll get today, we will also share a link to an evaluation and a certificate of completion. And we ask you to please complete our evaluation and provide your US mailing address, and we will send you a free Headspace tool, which you can put to work to discover if you are meeting those Headspace requirements for your recipe. So thanks for joining us today. And Kate, did you have anything else to add?
No, I think we did a pretty good job of getting through the questions. If we didn't get to your question, we have the ability to get a report through Zoom, so we can follow up with you via email. So thanks for joining us. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your summer, and hopefully we will see you mid-September.
We'll see you in the fall. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day. Enjoy your tomatoes.